Madam President, may I ask first unanimous consent that any pending quorum call be vitiated?
Without objection.
Thank you. May I ask unanimous consent to speak for up to 25 minutes as if in morning business?
Without objection.
Thank you. Madam President, I started my weekly series of speeches about the dangers of climate change back in the spring of 2012. My trusty time to wake up sign is getting a little battered and showing some wear and tear, but I am still determined to get us to act on climate before it is too late. The senator from New Hampshire clearly knows what is going on in her state. It is long past time to wake up to the industry-controlled campaign of calculated misinformation on the dangers of carbon pollution. Opponents of climate action relish operating in the dark. Their slimiest work to undermine science and deny the harmful effects of carbon pollution on human health, natural systems, and the economy is done by hidden hands through front groups. If anything is to change, we first need to acknowledge peer-reviewed science, the expert assessments of our military and national security leaders, and the business case for climate action iconic American companies are making. But if anything is really going to change, we need to shine a light on the sophisticated scheme of science denial being foisted on the American people. President Theodore Roosevelt once said, "Far and away the best prize that life offers is the chance to work hard at work worth doing." We in Congress have the chance to do this worthy work, but big special interests don't want that to happen. So Congress keeps drifting toward climate catastrophe. And I keep delivering my weekly remarks, today for the 150th time. Thankfully, I'm not a lone voice. Many colleagues have been speaking out, particularly our ranking member on the Environment and Public Works Committee, Senator Boxer, and one of our Democratic Party's presidential contenders, Senator Sanders. Senator Markey has been speaking on climate longer than I've even been in the Senate. Senators Schumer, Nelson, Blumenthal, Schatz, King, Baldwin, Brown, and Coons have each joined me to speak of the effects of carbon pollution on their home states and economies. Our Democratic leader, Senator Reid, has pressed the Senate to face up to this challenge. And 18 fellow Democratic colleagues, including climate champs Merkley, Warren, Markey, and Schumer, join me in calling out the industry-controlled, many-tentacled apparatus deliberately polluting our American discourse with climate science denial. The climate science that deniers try to undermine dates back to the 1800s, predating Henry Ford's first production Model T, predating Thomas Edison's first light bulb demonstration, and predating the first commercial oil well in the United States. It was 1824, around the time President Monroe added the South Portico to the White House, that French scientist Joseph Fourier explained that Earth's temperature would be much lower if the planet lacked an atmosphere, providing one of the first descriptions of the greenhouse effect. In 1861, the year President Lincoln took office, Irish physicist John Tyndall described the trace components of the atmosphere that were responsible for the greenhouse effect, including carbon dioxide, methane, and water vapor. In 1896, the year Utah joined the Union, Swedish scientist Svante Arrhenius published the first calculation of global warming due to the addition of carbon dioxide from the burning of fossil fuels. The concentration of carbon dioxide in the Earth's atmosphere at that time was 295 parts per million. Today, it's 400 parts per million and rising. Indeed, rising at a pace not seen for 66 million years. Scientific research continues to demonstrate planetary warming and the many changes that come with it. I'm from the ocean state, and we can particularly look at the oceans to see the devastating effects of climate change. Of course, the great corrupt denial machine the fossil fuel industry supports rarely talks about oceans. But remember, that machine doesn't care about evidence. It just wants to create phony doubt. But there's not much room for doubt in measurements of warming, rising, and acidifying seas, measured with everyday thermometers, with yardsticks, essentially, and pH tests. So, faced with all that measurement, they just don't go there. But the changes happening in the oceans are real. Our unfettered burning of fossil fuels has made our oceans warmer. The oceans have absorbed the vast majority of the heat trapped in our atmosphere by our carbon pollution. The heat equivalent to several Hiroshima-style atomic bombs being set off in the sea every second for the last 20 years. One result of all this heat is the calamity now taking place in the world's coral reefs, the incubators of the sea. Australia's Great Barrier Reef is the largest coral ecosystem on Earth. Severe bleaching has hit between 60 and 100% of corals on the Great Barrier Reef, according to Dr. Terry Hughes of James Cook University in Queensland. Research led by Dr. Andrew King at the University of Melbourne determined that the ocean warming that led to widespread and devastating coral destruction was made 175 times more likely by human-caused climate change. As one researcher put it, climate change is the smoking gun. But we're not just warming the oceans. The oceans actually absorb carbon dioxide itself as well as heat. And because carbon dioxide forms carbonic acid when it dissolves in seawater, the seas are acidifying at the fastest rate in 50 million years. On America's northwest coast, oyster hatcheries have already experienced significant losses when their new hatches were unable to grow their shells in the acidified seawater. Off the coast of Washington, Oregon, and Northern California, 50% of tiny sea snails called pteropods, these creatures right here, 50% of them were measured to have, quote, severe shell damage, mostly from acidified seas. A NOAA study released just last week detailed for the first time the extent to which that damage was caused by human carbon pollution. If this species collapses, the bottom falls out of the oceanic food chain. In Rhode Island, Narragansett Bay's mean winter water temperature is up nearly 4 degrees Fahrenheit. Our Rhode Island lobster fishery is crashing, and our winter flounder fishery is practically gone. I know that the New Hampshire fishery is equally stressed. Rhode Island's clammers, lobstermen, fish farmers, and shellfish growers are all watching with real alarm the damage acidified seas are doing. This is the cost of climate change in the oceans. Madam President, we're approaching a point of no return. The UN Environment Programme's Emissions Gap Report, released earlier this month, warned that unless reductions in carbon pollution from the energy sector are taken swiftly, it will be nearly impossible to keep warming below 2 degrees Celsius and avoid widespread catastrophe. The report says the next 3 years are, quote, likely the last chance to limit global warming to safe limits in this century. Likely the last chance to make the difference. But Republicans in this Senate want to do nothing about it. Once upon a time, Republicans joined Democrats in pushing for action on climate. Senator McCain ran for president on a strong climate change platform and was the lead co-sponsor of the Climate Stewardship Act, which would have created a market-based emissions cap and trade program to reduce carbon dioxide and other heat-trapping pollutants from the biggest U.S. sources. Here's what Senator McCain said at the time. While we cannot say with 100% confidence what will happen in the future, we do know the emission of greenhouse gases is not healthy for the environment. As many of the top scientists through the world have stated, the sooner we start to reduce these emissions, the better off we will be in the future. Other Republicans got behind cap and trade proposals. Senator Carper's Clean Air Planning Act at one time or another counted Senators Alexander, Graham, and Collins among its supporters. Senator Collins later co-authored her own important cap and trade bill with Senator Cantwell. Senator Kirk voted for the Waxman-Markey cap and trade bill in the House. And Senator Flake, then representing Arizona in the House, was an original co-sponsor of the Raise Wages, Cut Carbon Act to reduce payroll taxes for employers and employees in exchange for equal revenue from a carbon tax. So, what happened? Why did this steady heartbeat of Republican climate action suddenly flatline in 2010? Something happened right in 2010. What happened was the Supreme Court's disgraceful 2010 decision in Citizens United v. Federal Election Commission, where, in a nutshell, the court ruled corporations are people, money is speech, so there can be no limit to corporate money influencing American elections. When Citizens United uncorked all that big dark money and allowed it to cast its bullying shadow over Congress, Republicans walked back from any major climate legislation. Rather than freeing up open debate, Citizens United effectively ended any honest debate in Congress on the climate crisis. Unlimited corporate spending in politics can indeed corrupt, and not just through floods of anonymous attack advertisements. It can corrupt secretly and more dangerously through the mere threat of that spending, through private threats and promises. And sometimes the fossil fuel industry threat to politicians who don't toe their line is not so subtle. The Koch brothers-backed political juggernaut, Americans for Prosperity, has openly promised to punish candidates who support curbs on carbon pollution, and openly taken credit for the, quote, political peril, to use their words, political peril that organization created for Republicans on climate change. Since 2010, the fossil fuel industry's strategy has been to crush Republican opposition, to prohibit Republicans from working with Democrats on climate change so that the industry can disguise what is basically old-fashioned special interest pleading as a partisan issue in America's culture wars. I don't know if you remember the alien in the movie Men in Black who climbed into the skin and clothing of the unfortunate farmer. That's what the fossil fuel industry has done to the Republican Party since Citizens United. The industry has a lot at stake. The International Monetary Fund has reported the American subsidy for the United States fossil fuel industry at nearly $700 billion a year. That's billion with a B, and every year. How much trouble, I ask you, would an industry go to protect a $700 billion per year subsidy? A growing body of scholarship is examining the science denial apparatus protecting the fossil fuel industry, how it's funded, how it communicates, and how it propagates the denial message. That research includes work by Harvard's Naomi Oreskes, Michigan State's Aaron McWright, Oklahoma State's Riley Dunlap, Yale's Justin Farrell, Drexel's Robert Brule, and others. Industrial powers fighting to obscure the harms their products cause isn't new. They operate from a well-worn playbook. It was used for industrial contaminants and health hazards like DDT and CFCs, and of course, particularly, tobacco. It's the ultimate special interest lobbying. President-elect Trump campaigned on a pledge of draining the swamp of big special interests controlling Washington. Yet, Leading the transition at the Environmental Protection Agency for the Trump administration is Myron Ebell, the poster child of industry-backed climate denial. Mr. Ebell is the Director of Energy and Environment at the Competitive Enterprise Institute, a corporate front group that has specialized in undermining tobacco, climate, and other science. CEI received millions of dollars from ExxonMobil, from the Koch family, from coal companies Murray and Massey, and from the identity laundering groups Donors Trust and Donors Capital. CEI and Myron Ebell are the quintessential DC swamp creatures. Politico reports that Ebell was a veteran of the tobacco regulation wars. Jeremy Simons of the Environmental Defense Fund credits Ebell with taking the tobacco playbook and applying it to climate change. And on climate, Jerry Taylor of the Libertarian Niskanen Center says Ebell was, and I quote him here, involved in marshaling allies, building a skeptic movement, and enforcing that political orthodoxy as best he could in the Republican Party. Ebell criticizes scientists for working outside their degreed fields, but it turns out he isn't even a scientist himself. After college, he studied political theory at the London School of Economics and history at Cambridge. He has even criticized Pope Francis's encyclical on climate change, calling it scientifically ill-informed, economically illiterate, intellectually incoherent, and morally obtuse. That's rich right there. An outspoken climate contrarian whose organization receives fossil fuel money calling Pope Francis morally obtuse. Well, the president-elect mocked Republican politicians when they went groveling before the Koch brothers at their begathon, as the president-elect called it. But now he is busy filling his staff with Koch operatives. Donald Trump may have won the presidency, but with operatives like Myron Ebell, the Koch brothers are moving in to run the presidency. The new president, however, will hear from our military, he'll hear from our national labs, he'll hear from NASA, who with a rover driving around on Mars right now may actually know a little science, that this is deadly serious. I encourage President-elect Trump to listen to the voices of reason and expertise, not to the swamp things. Don't, Mr. President-elect, be taken in by industry, lobbyists, and front groups scratching and clawing to protect a $700 billion conflict of interest. Consider, Mr. President-elect, listening to your children who joined you just 7 years ago in saying climate science was irrefutable and portends, quote, catastrophic and irreversible consequences. That is what you and they said just 7 years ago. Madam President, let's assume something. Let's assume that all our national labs, let's assume that NASA and NOAA, let's assume that our military leaders, let's assume that our home state universities across our 50 states, and let's assume that hundreds of major American companies and the more than 190 different nations that signed the Paris Climate Agreement, let's assume that they are all actually not deluded about climate change, that they're not part of a hoax. If that's so, if these trained expert scientists who don't labor under a $700 billion per year conflict of interest are telling the truth, then the fossil fuel industry's science denial operation is a fraud. As a fraud, Madam President, it is a particularly evil one. because in order to achieve its goal, the industry has to drag down the government of the United States, or at least the Congress of the United States, to its level. The fossil fuel industry maintains a science denial operation and a political influence operation designed and intended to willfully sabotage the proper operation of a branch of the government of the United States. We ought to all have a problem when a powerful special interest is willing to damage our American experiment in democracy just to achieve its selfish ends. As a senator, John F. Kennedy once said, "Let us not despair, but act. Let us not seek the Republican answer or the Democratic answer, but the right answer. Let us not seek to fix the blame for the past. Let us accept our own responsibility for the future." Solutions to climate change need be neither Republican nor Democratic. They do need to be based in sound science and healthy and open debate, and we will be a stronger and more respected country if they are American solutions, if we are leading the world, not tailing along behind other countries. For a country like ours that claims to stand as an example, as a city on a hill, we call it, a country that benefits from the power of our example around the world, this horrible example of out-of-control special interest influence will have lasting consequences. Madam President, we have a role to play in this world, we Americans, and it's time we got about it. I yield the floor and note the absence of a quorum.
The clerk will call the roll. Mr.